Oh. I couldn't have possibly closed out 2023 without covering one of the major drops from McFarlane, and that was going to be the slightly surprising but also kind of expected, so it's a bit of an oxymoron, the Batman and Robin wave, which frankly I didn't really expect until early next year, but it looks like they managed to make the cut, especially since one of those figures happens to have already been released. So now we finally got the proper remainder of the wave, including the Build-A-Figure pieces for that Mr. Freeze. And so I desperately wanted to make sure that my last video for 2023 was going to be covering the McFarlane Batman and Robin wave, especially as one singular video covering the entirety of the wave as far as how it sends the message across that McFarlane still has some tricks up their sleeve. One of which, I gotta be honest, has to be that packaging. It's that box, man. There's something about the aesthetic that they decided to go with in this box that's a perfect combination of the classic tropes you expect from McFarlane Toys with their DC Multiverse line. You still got an awful lot of the logos, the stenciling, the black with the white, the blue font, the background as far as the main cardboard insert you get inside. Unfortunately, you still got the twisty ties, the plastic encasing that's holding the capes, that's damaging the capes in the process when you take them out. But what really stood out to me and made me go, yo, I almost kind of want to commemorate these things, is the little black and red gradient from the Batman and Robin marketing as far as the actual art design, the posters, the logos, etc., all that stuff, the Taco Bell toys that they decided to replicate and still put on the sides of these boxes and the top with the logos. I don't know, there's something about it that is just so pleasant to look at that I'm like, yes, I really love these boxes, and I want to make sure that they're as mint as humanly possible, even though by definition they're no longer mint because I cracked them open. But I want to keep them in pristine condition as much as possible, and I wanted to give them a shout out for doing that because they really could have just gone with generic packaging with just a simple logo on the side, but they actually changed up the boxes, and I'm hoping very highly that they do something similar with that eminent Batman Forever wave. So let's get things started here with probably the most easy one to do, which is going to be the Clooney Batman himself. And it's going to be easy because, frankly, this little segment here is just going to predominantly be a comparison. Because pretty much confirming what I was already expecting, especially when Todd was doing those like sneak preview things back in New York Comic Con, and eventually all the other things and showcases that he was doing for McFarlane Toys, especially for ToyCon, etc. They pretty much ended up using the exact same buck and overall mold, completely overhauled from the Ultimate Movie Collection 6-pack. And I've already done a full-length review of that figure along with the Kilmer version, and that's where I fully break down exactly how I feel about this figure in terms of articulation, detail, the cloth cape, etc., and everything that kind of came with the package. So if you guys want to check out a much more in-depth review of the Clooney figure, you guys can check out that video, which I'll probably post in the annotation that you see in the end screen. So you guys can simply just wait until the end of this video and then check that out if you haven't already done so. So basically, because of that, I'm going to skip a little bit of what really made this figure great, because to kind of put it in layman's terms, this was one of the more surprising things about that Ultimate Movie Collection, that one of the worst interpretations, portrayals of Batman, not necessarily Clooney's fault, but the combination of Schumacher, his campy feel, combined with the studio wanting to sell toys, it just ended up in the disaster known as Batman and Robin. And so it was really ironic to me, poetically ironic, that that was actually what gave birth to practically one of the finer movie versions of a McFarlane Toys Batman, and that's this guy right here, because I feel like the Panther suit translated very well, proportions are nice, articulation feels great, the cloth cape actually works in tandem with the figure, and that's actually a pretty good likeness of Clooney. So all those compliments, minus a couple of quirks here and there that I'm not really a huge fan of, specifically those clips that are holding the cape that feel like they could easily break, and then a little bit of the diapers a little wobbly here and there. But all that aside, that just means that this figure is just as great, because ideally it's the exact same thing. The only noticeable differences that I could pick apart that were just very apparent, apart from the very obvious one that I'll tackle in a minute, is going to be, you'll notice that there's a little bit of a glossier turn to the version that was part of this wave, as opposed to the slightly much more matted or muted look to the Panther suit in the original 6-pack. But frankly, I almost don't feel like that is intentional. I feel like that was just a manufacturing thing that just came out of printing with the filaments, the printer heads as far as paint applications. So that's more so of a your mileage may vary sort of thing. Him being a little shinier, you might end up getting a unit from this wave that ends up being just as muted as this guy. Same thing could be said about the Clooney likeness, because the sculpting is still there, but I noticed that it's a bit more saturated, or rather desaturated, on the new Batman and Robin wave version versus that of the Ultimate Six Pack. I feel like the colors are a little bit more pronounced on this version, but at the same time, because of the muted colors on his mouth plate, it looks like that classic Clooney smirk is coming across a little better on this version than it did over here, because of how pronounced and how much darker the shading is around his lips. So outside of those things that, like I said, are very one-to-one case basis, the only real intentional change that was, like I said, a preemptive change to overhaul and completely change up from the original six-pack release is going to be the most obvious one, of course, the cape. This time they went for a rubberized cape instead of the cloth one, and you guys know how I feel about specific rubberized capes. There's certain ones that really hit in a very exceptional way that complement the figure, and then there's others that just feel pretty shoddy in hand. And ordinarily, when it comes to this slightly flimsy material that they utilize for this specific version of the Clooney Batman, I would generally complain, because I really do not like the feel of this. It just feels like I'm holding a Tupperware that was melted down and serving as a cape with the traditional Batman trimming towards the bottom. So overall, I just frankly don't like this material. I don't like the glossiness. I don't like how flimsy it looks and how easily it could be to tear because of how much of a thinner material it is, specifically around the areas that plastic prison inside of the box was actually holding it together. Around these areas, you can actually kind of see it warping and tearing in these specific areas right here where it was holding it together. So when pulling it out of the packaging, it's going to warp and potentially cut into the rubber itself, and I hate it when I get scared out of my mind to try to pull these things out of the box because of that little slit that's holding it together. I really wish that they would change that mentality. With all that said, if there was a material that would actually fit a specific Batman figure, it would actually be this one. In a huge turn of events, if there was one material where this sort of reflective, very flimsy and very latexy kind of look to the cape that just feels just so weird in hand would actually complement a figure and make it look better, it would actually be with the Panther suit on the Clooney Batman. If it was on any other Batman, I would be throwing a fit and be like, why did they go with this cape? But with all the portrayals of Batman out there, it's actually Clooney that's able to pull it off, and possibly a Panther suit version of Kilmer. Outside of those two guys, I really hate this material, and I wish that they don't really do it too much again. But here, it's probably one of the few exceptions where it really does work. And frankly, as far as that dynamic look of having it giving him a wider kind of look and a much more imposing presence to actually make Clooney's Batman look, dare I say, badass, the cape actually kind of works in this respect, as opposed to the cloth cape. Not to say that the cloth cape isn't bad, it still feels pretty premium and nice in hand as far as the quality, as far as giving it that amplified look, but you do still have to do a little bit of work yourself to kind of tailor it, make sure that it's flushing with the shoulders, etc. Here, the work is already kind of done for you, and as long as it didn't tear pulling him out of the package, looking at him like this, it complements well, and it looks pretty nice. So it's kind of a preference thing. I'm just kind of happy that I own both of these guys in case there's one to stock and one to rock, but at least I can say that since they simply just didn't necessarily try to fix what wasn't broken, that was ultimately the way to go, and this automatically makes Batman the standout amongst the wave so far. So now we must see if the remainder of the wave can be up to snuff, starting with the Boy Wonder, Robin. Easily one of the more controversial aspects of Batman and Robin because of how whiny and annoying and just so needless he was on the scene, and it just made Batman all the more complacent by just kind of putting up with this shit. I just don't understand it. But nevertheless, they made him a figure here in McFarlane Toys Wave because obviously you kind of have to. You know, it is the Crystal Donald portrayal, and frankly, out of all the versions of Robin, as far as the live-action Robins that we've seen, which, now that I think about it, I think this is the only version, I gotta be honest, this is probably my favorite as far as costume portrayal. Sure, he had the much more faithful adaptation in Batman Forever, with the red and the green and the yellow, a little bit of the yellow here and there with the R. But there's something that just pleases my personal favorite clash of colors, which is of course going to be mainly black with some red accents. And they managed to make that happen here with the Batman and Robin version, with the red Robin kind of streaking across the sleeves, meeting in the middle with the chest symbol. The nipples are still present, so it's cool that they kept that intact. But then the remainder of the Panther suit also translate, for the most part, pretty well here. And it's pretty par for the course as far as McFarlane and what they're known for, as far as texturing to making sure that you have that very latexy material. So you're going to notice an awful lot of practices here that you've seen many times before here, but that's what McFarlane is known for. So you're going to have an awful lot of that happening in the thighs, in the bicep and shoulder area, as well as the boots and the forearms. You see an awful lot of that Kevlar-esque kind of texture work happening. Now, kind of going back to something that I mentioned with the Clooney cape, where that was actually complementing the figure, a negative being turned into a positive. Here we have a negative kind of remaining a negative. Now, it doesn't feel as flimsy or as very easily rippable as that Clooney version really did, but it's not as wide and as dynamic enough as that original Clooney one. So therefore, the cape is just kind of there, especially as it kind of gets thinner right here. I feel like it's a very much at risk of ripping off. It feels just a little loose in place, at least for my particular unit, but at least it gets a little thicker and more robust as we kind of build towards this semi-blowing in the wind kind of look to it that at least adds a little bit of action, so it's not static, but it's also not completely conjoined and kind of winded up to the side to then only favor certain amount of poses. That's always been an exaggeration that I've never been a huge fan of. So it's good to see that they've found a happy medium for Robin. Now, kind of speaking to what I mentioned of how weird it kind of feels just a little bit here at the top of the cape, this also kind of brought to my attention something that I kind of noticed as I kind of played with the figure a little bit more, is that even though you have an awful lot of trappings from McFarlane that work really well as far as the Panther suit, making sure that the utility belt looks nice, which is pretty pronounced there in the middle with the Robin symbol, as well as just overall the gauntlets, you know, kind of translating that really classic Schumacher look, and even the likeness to Chris O'Donnell. I frankly feel like maybe they may have given him a little too wide of a chin, because he did have a bit more of a round head, so this one is more square by comparison. But at least the likeness is there. I can definitely tell that that's Chris O'Donnell. Really good paint application as far as the mask and the hair. But I have to be specific with those facets of the head sculpt, because this is what I was going to get into, is that even though they managed to nail certain things and make me go, yeah, this is the Robin, it might have been a little unlucky of me for this particular unit, because I feel like a handful of QC issues managed to come across here, and I'm curious to see if several different people have been dealt the same hand as well. Starting off with that Chris O'Donnell likeness, because even though 90% of it is there, if I look a little closely, I noticed that as well sculpted as that smirk is, that classic Chris O'Donnell, very smart-ass look, they did something to the lips that painted them just a little too high. So I was a little bummed to see that. And then as I'm kind of scanning the figure, I'm noticing, is it just me? Or is that red a little sickly looking? It doesn't look as saturated or as cherry red as his actual costume did, let alone some of those prototype shots for this guy that were revealed earlier in the year. So I was like, you know, is it just me, or is this specific red just a little bit on the muted side that I would have liked it? I really love it when the dark red is able to complement the black, and I don't really see that happening too much here. The more I see it in the light, it just looks a little too orangey. It kind of leans more towards an orange hue. And the matters are only made worse by the fact that if you look a little closer, it looks like some of that red is either misaligned here in the middle portion where the Robin symbol truly is, and then a little bit of drippage happened alongside the left nipple, if you will, this left chest area. I could see a little red streak kind of piercing down towards the bottom, almost like it's parting. So yeah, it looked like quite a few QC issues managed to affect my specific unit here, especially with a little bit of the separation happening with the cape and even this color piece towards the top. And as I was kind of finagling here, I also noticed a little bit of the skin paint managed to drip on the collar itself. So yeah, a couple of things here and there that made me think, okay, those are QC issues and they could just be beholden to my one unit here, but it also makes me wonder, it's into those infinite amount of possibilities. Was that a byproduct of just crunching this guy out? And I'm now calling out to you guys. If you guys have received your own specific Robin, especially if it came from McFarlane toy stores themselves, which mine did, it didn't come from like Target or whatever, it wasn't like secondhand or anything like that. It came directly from the source. So I'm hoping that nothing got too expedited in the process. But at least one aspect of the figure that didn't suffer was the articulation, which is handled pretty modestly. The head is still able to turn all the way around, as well as being able to tilt slightly towards the top. I would have wished for just a little bit better on that, but it can definitely tilt towards the bottom and even side to side pretty generously. Then the top arms, you'll notice right there a little bit of that washer piece inside is a little on the loose side, but that was the only way to really get the connection of the red to match that of the symbol across the sleeve. So you needed to have that happen. But thankfully, due to that looseness, not only can you get some really good shrugging and butterfly motion, but general rotation vertical 360, as well as proper extension towards the sides. That feels pretty good in hand. Biceps can definitely swivel all the way around, as you can see right there. And then you still got those two joints at the elbows that are fully able to bend all the way up. Wrists can still rotate all the way around 360, as well as slightly bend inwards and outwards. It's just a little robust on Robin, because I noticed that out of all the figures in the wave, yes, even including Batman and Batgirl, his cuffs on his gauntlets are a little bit on the thicker side. That bending the wrist inwards and outwards, it does it pretty well going outwards, but inwards is just a little bit on the hindered side, just mildly, just a little bit right there. But at least what's not hindered, that torso. This torso is actually pretty flexible and pretty nice. It could definitely rotate all the way around on the mid-torso cut 360, as well as being able to crunch inwards and outwards pretty fluidly, and even side to side a little bit on the obliques. Waist articulation can't really go all the way around because of the diaper, but it can still nudge its way almost left and right to allow just more mobility all the way around in that torso piece, which frankly I have to give a compliment to that diaper piece, because I like that. Unlike Clooney, his is a little bit more straightforward and tight, doesn't really necessarily sag down, and flushes with the rest of the Panther suit, especially around the leg area, so that's pretty nice. But not enough to hinder any of the top leg joints. Both of those joints can still allow the leg to fully move all the way up like so, as well as slightly towards the back, but not any more than the typical McFarlane because of the diaper, and can still extend towards the sides, so the diaper at least doesn't hinder that. Almost a full 180, as you can see right about right there. Two knee joints that can still bend all the way up like your typical Bat family character, and thankfully they still have that flush ankle joint that I really like, that can fully rotate at both top and bottom parts of that joint all the way around 360, as well as bend downwards and upwards on a ratcheted joint. And toesies can still be found there, can almost bend at the, actually they can. What am I talking about? They can fully bend 90 degrees. That is crazy. So articulation is completely not necessarily unparalleled, but uncompromised still for even a Batman and Robin figure. So that's crazy that you can still find an awful lot of flexibility in posing, even with some of these characters right here. And frankly, like I said, I can't really knock it, especially when they're able to still deliver on joints that work right out of the box. I'm still reeling from that PTSD. But I can tell you this, that PTSD was not as bad as when I realized why Uncle Alfred has the exact measurements of his niece committed to memory. Okay, so such as the thing that I need to recall when covering the Batgirl figure included here, portrayed by Alicia Silverstone. And frankly, one of the aspects of the movie that we can all agree was frankly just kind of terrible. I don't know. It's like nobody was there to like tell her how to act. Anyways, so frankly, a slot needed to be filled in for that wave, and Batgirl was kind of a given, considering that, yeah, maybe in the movie she was, like I said, controversial, but at least for a figure, especially coming from McFarlane, who knows how to handle this material, again, they will excel at least at delivering a pretty solid figure. And I feel like that's pretty much what they were able to hit the mark with, is that material. Sure, you're going to have some little areas here that feel replicated from past Batman figures or Batgirl figures that McFarlane has tackled before, especially with the very thigh-high kind of boots right here with the little symbols kind of embedded into them, as well as the heels. And then you have a good majority of the actual physique behind the Batgirl figure that it's gonna ring very familiar to an awful lot of collectors. As I was kind of like messing around with the articulation, messing around with with the different proportions, I feel like I've handled this figure before, but at least they were able to tailor aspects about the costume to fit that of Alicia Silverstone's version in the Batman and Robin movie. Specifically, the belt, as you can see, you can still see the bat symbol from the Schumacher movies embedded into that. You have an awful lot of like the little zippers and the little aesthetical kind of accents that kind of line up a little bit of the leathery areas of the torso. Of course, the little boob cups that you have going on right there in the middle, and then right above them you have the Batgirl symbol. Though I don't want to rewatch the movie, I frankly don't remember her gauntlets, at least the spike on the gauntlets, being this protruding. I don't know, they're just kind of strange to me, strange looking, but if they're faithful and if they're there, maybe I'll just watch the suit up scene and just making sure that they are accurate. But for the most part, you see an awful lot of, things that were taken from that suit, specifically even the heels. You still have them happening right here. To me, I think the strongest aspect of the Batgirl figure here, apart from a pretty modest likeness to Alicia Silverstone here in the head sculpt, in my opinion, I feel like she was given just a little bit too much makeup as far as the pasty look to her skin, but at least the mask is done pretty well, painted on and even etched in to make sure that it looks like it's actually lifting from the skin. To me, frankly, though, the highlights would have to be, well, the highlights inside of the blonde kind of wig or hairpiece happening here on the top part, where you see an awful lot of the roots underneath kind of bleeding on through and feel like they're actually part of the hair, so that's pretty cool. Obviously they start to fade out and kind of disappear when you look at the hair from the back, but at least when you're in the back, you'll notice that again, the biggest strength to the Batgirl figure here would have to be just how well McFarlane was able to nail creases and an actual realistic cloth look to the suit. Perfectly embodied by the cape here, which, like I just mentioned with Robin, I'm not the biggest fan of when it's kind of pre-molded into this windy kind of look, but much like Robin, they nailed a midway point here where it's not completely blowing in the wind, but it's also not pretty just boring and static and straight down the middle. It's actually kind of coarse towards the side a little bit here to give it a little bit of life. But that's not what stands out to me. To me, would have to be the little creases in between each kind of like rift right here to symbolize kind of like the wings, especially with the trimming here towards the bottom. Something that Robin didn't have, but Batman did. And so to see it kind of work in favor of the creasing of the suit, I don't know, for some reason this design choice stands out to me pretty favorably. I actually do like it. It's just a shame that, again, the little plastic slit inside of the box is damaging the sides right here. I'm not a huge fan of that. But at least I'm able to see that that's a theme that McFarlane was able to kind of retain for the remainder of the costume. Because if you look closely at like some of the boot areas and even a little bit here throughout the gauntlets, they still did a remarkable job of making sure that you could still see so much of those little like wrinkles and stretchings of the cloth happening here on the calves around her heel area. You could see how it's kind of molded into the plastic to make it look like a legitimate boot that is being kind of pulled up towards the top and actually kind of creating that illusion like it's cloth. And to me, to capture that in a 7-inch scale, it's pretty remarkable. You even see a little bit more of that happening here on the gauntlets and the torso area. That's not to say that some of the other figures in the wave had that as well. Robin himself even has a few creases around the gauntlets. But it's just that to me, I don't know if it's because of the physique or, like I said, the illusion that's created by the cape, it just stands out to me a little bit more on the Batgirl. And much like the Robin figure, the articulation is pretty nice. Pretty standard, but still nice. Now, one of my major fears, not just for Batgirl, but pretty much the two main female characters in this wave, were going to be the hair pieces hindering the head articulation. And it is a little present here with Batgirl because as you try to rotate her head, obviously it's not going to do the full 180, and even if you tried, you risk damaging kind of like the end pieces of the hairpiece, but it could still move, in my opinion, better than even some other McFarlanes I've seen in the past. Batwoman in that 3-pack, I'm just saying. So they're able to flex kind of a little bit out of the way, and she can still turn pretty modestly left to right. Not much in the way of tilting up because the hair just kind of stops it in its tracks, but at least leaning towards the front, at least a little bit more than a little bit of the hunch kind of look to her neck is already kind of giving, is still provided pretty well. Tilting, though, is pretty much gone because of the hairpiece, so that just kind of comes with the territory. But at least the hairpiece is not able to really hinder too much of the top arm articulation. You just got to make sure that like I said, the little end pieces here of the hair is able to kind of flex and move out of the way. But technically, the joints on the top arms can still vertically rotate 360 degrees. Extension towards the sides is pretty nice. No real shrug mobility that I can really find there amongst the butterfly. Well, not really a butterfly joint, but rather the kind of rod inside. Slight movement, cylindrical movement happening right there, but it's not as good as that of Robin's or even Batman's. Biceps can still rotate 360 degrees right about right there, and despite the physique, you could still pose the elbows to bend almost all the way up right there without any kind of floundering or risk of breaking. The wrist can still move, rotate 360 degrees, as well as bend inwards and outwards. In my opinion, just a little better than that of Robin's because of how much thinner she is around the forearm area. They can still flex pretty generously. And kind of in the same vein as far as the physique complementing the articulation, torso is actually pretty nice. You can still rotate at the mid-torso cut almost a full 360 degrees, as well as being able to really stretch towards the back almost at a 90-degree angle. She's pretty flexible, if I do say so myself. God, how can I not make this weird? But she can also crunch inwards pretty nice as well, towards the sides on the obliques really nicely, and almost kind of a full swivel right about right there at the mid-torso cut. And unlike the Batman and Robin duo, the waist can fully rotate 360 degrees without any problem that I can really find whatsoever, and even further crunching and extension there. Not as good as the mid-torso, but at least a little bit to kind of aid even further than that before. And then the top leg joints can still move towards the front, like so. Pretty standard for McFarlane. Bat sculpt, I'm sorry, that was a Freudian slip. Butt sculpt is still present there. It's not as pronounced as it was in the movie due to that suit-up scene, but it's still wide enough there to kind of hinder a little bit of the top leg joints going towards the back. Not as badly as Robin's, but still can be found right about right there. And then extension towards the sides is almost at the full 180, so pretty flexible there. Knees can still fully bend all the way up at the two spots right there. And out of all the characters, she was the one that I knew needed to have a very flush ankle joint because of how much of a thinner physique she was going to have around that area, but also because of the heels. And thankfully, it is still there. It's pretty flexible, allowing the foot to pretty much pivot downwards all the way there and all the way up to about right there via the rotated joint. And thankfully that joint, again flush to the ankle and very proportionate and very accurate to the physique, can fully rotate. It's a little bit stagnant on some of mine here with Batgirl, but can technically still rotate 360 degrees at the bottom and even at the top, except at the top it's a little more rigid than I would have liked, but still allows for some decent balancing, especially with the fact that she has heels, so that's going to be pretty precarious, but at least you still have toe articulation that can fully bend up at the tip, right about right there, so that should hopefully favor an awful lot of the potential balancing issues that she will have, especially with, like I said, the heels, because, I mean, those things are just hell in real life, so being in action figure form, that's not necessarily going to be all that much different. But she ain't the only one sporting the heels amongst the wave. You have, of course, here Poison Ivy, played by Uma Thurman, making up, again, in a very surprising and ironic kind of way, probably my favorite out of the entire wave. That's not Batman. Batman is still peak amongst the wave, but if we're not counting Batman, non-Batman figures strictly, I gotta be honest, spoilers, I think she's my favorite. I don't know what it is, but she's probably the one that created the most impression on me, the biggest impression at least, as far as taking something that just looked very cartoony, very campy, very just completely out of place in live action, and then giving it the McFarlane treatment, but in a way that just feels just a little bit more grounded. I don't know what it is, but it's crazy to say that the costume, the way that they were able to etch it out here in McFarlane Toys form, just feels a lot more grounded than whatever the hell Schumacher and the costumers were able to do to Uma Thurman in that movie. Because here, you could see that, sure, they took an awful lot of inspiration as far as the tunic, as far as the stockings, the things around the arms, the little bits of leaves, etc., but they just gave it this texturized overhaul that McFarlane is able to excel at as far as kind of looking at a different facet that I feel they should probably do a little bit more of, because I've mentioned a number of times in several different reviews on the channel that McFarlane is really good at airbrushing certain pieces of plastic to make them look very metal, very weathered, to give it that very metallic and gun brush metal kind of look. And so that's one of their key strengths. Little do they know, I feel, that they can do similar kind of effects in a very effective way with foliage, with greenery. And I feel like Poison Ivy is able to exemplify that very well, especially in the mid-torso area where you do have this tunic piece, because the different paint applications they were able to apply to give it this really textured and very layered leaf effect around the torso area, mainly here on the bodice, if you will. It just, I don't know what it is, but there's something about the texture that just stands out to me as a very exceptional paint app that just stands out as quality. And then as you kind of navigate the stockings, you have a specific vine right here to just kind of give it a little bit of a textured design. But I really dig the gradient effect of having the very light leafy green here towards the top, but then it just kind of fades into this very dark shrubbery kind of green around the boot area. But you still have little textures and details to make it clear that that she's wearing heels and she's got stockings on top of those. So you have a little bit more of the vinage going on right here around the calf and shin area, and then of course leading into the heels. But it just has this really blended look that just complements the figure as well as the overall physique. And to add even more surprise to how impressed I was with the figure, she stands pretty well, especially for a figure that, like I said, is sporting heels. So that is generally a sign that this is going to be a nuisance to get to stand. But I guess they figured out the proportions or the balancing that ever so often she'll kind of tip off a little bit. But for the general time that I've played with this figure and tried to pose her, display her, shoot B-roll for her, I gotta be honest, very seldom did I resort to some of those elevated figure displays. But any kind of assistance, whether it be from the McFarlane displays that they, the circular bases or the flight stands or any kind of external assistance, she actually manages to stand on her own, not just literally in terms of balancing, but also figuratively amongst the wave, because frankly, I'm just really impressed with an awful lot of the attention to detail and care they were able to give her on the paint apps. The skin tone really matches fairly well. And then to me, I gotta be honest, that is frankly a very impressive likeness to Uma Thurman. She's got the high cheekbones, she's got a little bit of that smirk around the nose and lip area, the eyes. A little bit of extra work could have been added to the little pieces of leaves that she has around the eyebrows and the hair. And speaking of that hair, I can definitely tell that they kind of replicated some pieces from some prior McFarlanes, whether it be the aforementioned Batwoman, that very controversial Batwoman that was covered here on the channel. Just check out that comment section. But outside of even that figure, maybe even some of the Aquaman Mira figures from 2018. So you can see they just kind of took some of those blueprints and applied it to Uma, because it kind of makes sense. This is the same exact kind of shade, the same kind of style that she had in the movie, so they just had to really retrofit a little bit of the area that is in front of the headband and just simply attach this piece right here. But what really helps is that the piece itself doesn't really feel terribly rigid as even, say, like I said, that Batwoman figure, where the hair was just kind of getting in the way as far as posability or displays. Here, it feels like they were able to at least shrink it down, or at least make it out of a material that just bends a little bit more favorably than that one did. So just overall, the actual look and the shelf presence that Uma herself gives off here is actually pretty remarkable. And as I kind of alluded to there, moving the hairpiece also allows for some really good mobility of the head joint. It's not going to be able to do the full 180 because of the hair is eventually going to get in the way of those arms. But like I said, I feel like I've dealt with some female Batman characters or female McFarlane characters overall that have had hair that just kind of gets in the way. Hell, I'll even say that the Batgirl that I just covered right now has a little bit more hindrance happening to her than even Poison Ivy does here. She's able to turn left and right a little further than even Batgirl was able to do. Slight tilting towards the top, but not much in the way because of the hair getting in the way here towards the back. Good tilting towards the front, however. Good crunching inside of the neck joint. So it kind of requires a little bit of finagling, but like I said, I feel like it's more generous than it has been in some other figures, especially when you're able to kind of get some of the hair strands on the sides out of the way. Not only can you showcase a little bit more of the physique and skin tone that they were able to nail here, but she actually is able to kind of express by moving the neck. That is such a concept. You'll notice that she still has these little washers right here that favor arm articulation, that it's fully able to rotate all the way around vertically, as well as proper extension and even some really good shrugging motion, albeit at the cost of having that washer piece be a little too loose. And in that looseness, I discovered that the rod inside, the actual joint rod that is holding the arm in place inside of the socket, is also painted green. I know this is practically a nothing burger, I understand, but there's a part of me that feels like my OCD gets triggered by the fact that it's not skin tone colored the inside of that joint, that they could have just added that, but instead, if you move it in the perfect angle, you'll notice that the rod is green, and I'm like, why couldn't it just be the beige? But anyways, like I said, 99% of the time, you're not going to notice. So I completely understand, I fully know that is just the nitpickiest of nitpicks. I'm just saying. It's just something that I discovered while playing around with the figure. But the biceps are perfectly masked via this piece right here that makes up her sleeve. So that's pretty cool that they were able to hide it away. I mean, if I was a toy developer, that's definitely how I would do it. So it's cool that they pretty much did the same thing here. Pretty smart move. Two joints at the elbows that are fully able to bend all the way up. And even the wrist is made out of this flush piece that I've seen before. And it's good to see that on such a smaller scale physique for like Poison Ivy, makes sense to have it be incorporated here. That allows the wrist to fully rotate 360, as well as being able to bend pretty evenly, a 90-degree right about right there, especially for a very flamboyant character like Poison Ivy, especially with the gestures that she has around the hands, especially either this one or even the kiss blowing one, such as this one, especially with the little leaf detail inside right there. That's pretty cool. You definitely got to make sure that those wrists are rather expressive. And the texture work around the leaf tunic that I was praising before does a really good job of masking some of the torso articulation you have going on right here. You have the mid-torso cut that can definitely rotate 360, as well as crunch pretty well towards the inside and extend towards the back and even side to side like so. Full rotation on the waist as well, that is able to turn all the way around 360, and even some more crunching in practically all directions. So she is probably one of the more flexible characters amongst the wave, and probably even some more recent McFarlane releases. Then the top leg joints can definitely extend towards the front like so. Diaper piece flushes very well, but also not too tight to kind of limit this mobility. And frankly, I must say, she can move the leg towards the back, probably the furthest out of all of these figures in this wave, as well as also proper extension, almost at the 180 on the legs as well. Knee joints are no different. 2 points right there that can fully bend the boot as well as the overall leg upwards about that far. And then of course those very nice ankle joints that I like, that are flush to the rest of the leg, can fully bend up and down, as well as rotate at 2 parts, both at the bottom and at the top, as well as slight pivoting at the bottom joint, as you can see right there. And you're definitely going to need those because of the aforementioned heels, because like I said, I feel like she's one of the more favorable ones as far as heel wearing characters, but at least she just kind of surprised me overall. And if you need some extra balancing work, you of course have the little toesies right there that are fully able to bend all the way up. And wow, I totally did not mean to put her in this pose. I didn't think that it would work, but it actually kind of does. So as you can see right here, even by accident, posing her and getting her into a very expressive state, it's actually a very remarkable one that just kind of, like I said, breathes a lot of life into the character in a way that just surprised me. And frankly, I feel confident in saying that this is probably, Batman withstanding, this is my favorite amongst the wave, even counting her partner in crime, because if you guys remember from Batman and Robin, she wasn't working alone. So I'm going to need everyone to chill when I say that she's even better than, yes, the Build-A-Figure that's part of the entire wave as you assemble him together from the different pieces included in each of the releases, and that's going to be Arnold's I can't even take it. I can't even take him seriously. I can't talk about Arnold Schwarzenegger without doing the accent, without doing some kind of thing. And even he himself is proud of it. But of course, you're gonna have Arnie's Mr. Freeze right here, complete with his super campy suit. That overall, it actually does look like one of the more impressive Build-A-Figures. It's definitely got quite a bit of presence, especially when you see just how high he's towering. I can even barely fit him in frame here, but assembling him wasn't necessarily all too bad. I would probably say that, as always, they have to figure out something about the top leg joints to get them to actually flush in there and get past the diaper. That was probably the most complicated part. Everything else was pretty straightforward. The arms popped right into place almost at the very first try, second try for the head, and then everything else just kind of came together in a way where I'm like, all right, this is definitely not one of the more tedious assemblies of a Build-A-Figure. Look to practically all the Bane Build-A-Figures that McFarlane has done thus far, whether it be Last Night on Earth or even the Dark Knight Trilogy wave. I mean, those have been atrocious. So it's good, very, very good, and a huge relief to see that it does seem like they took their time assembling together and making sure things worked right out of the gate, or rather box, for Mr. Freeze here. And overall, I'd say that, yeah, similar to what I've said before about McFarlane taking live-action portrayals of certain Batman characters and then giving them the McFarlane DC Multiverse treatment, there's going to be little aspects here and there that look just a tinge cartoony as far as just exaggerating proportions, exaggerating details. One thing that I do feel they nailed was the Arnie likeness. You can definitely see that coming across fairly well on the head sculpt, which not only is it painted pretty well, and sure, you got the characteristics that make up Arnie that are good for what it's trying to achieve. I do think that maybe a little bit more pronunciation around the bottom jaw that Arnie's known for, or at least a very scowling kind of brow, you know, that very formidable brow that he's got going on. I feel like some of those little details could have been strengthened up a bit, but for the most part, I can definitely tell that that is Arnie's Mr. Freeze. To me, what stands out the most would have to be the translucent blue plastic around the helmet to actually give it that extra little premium detail. And then if you look a little carefully, you'll notice that they even went ahead and painted in a little bit of the red around the corners of his eyes to symbolize that, yeah, even though he's wearing his suit, he's still outside of his element. He's not in full-on cold, so a little bit of his sickness is still managing to seep in. So it's a nice little nuance that I actually really did appreciate as I kind of scanned the head sculpt. Once you get to the rest of the body, yes, I can already see people going into the keyboard and saying, "David, of course it's a toy. It's gonna look toyish." I'm sorry, but McFarlane has done a very effective job of making some of their other action figures have this really quality, very premium collector feel. Mr. Freeze, however, I noticed that an awful lot of their Mr. Freezes, whether it be that recent comic book version or even this one, they do something with the plastic and with the shading that, sure, it may be accurate to the portrayal, especially it sounds like the pod calling the kettle black regarding Batman and Robin, because the whole purpose of that movie was to sell goddamn toys. So it's pretty ironic for me to say that the Mr. Freeze here does feel a little too toyish when it comes to the actual plastic utilized and a little bit of the gray and the silver utilized here, because even though they were able to nail the shade of blue around these little oval pieces that are on his thighs, that are on his legs, chest, etc., to just kind of give it that Schumacher look, the rest of the silver, I feel, is lacking just a little bit of extra paint decal. Especially when, again, I've mentioned before that McFarlane is known for doing that airbrushed kind of metal look, or at least kind of give it this chrome look. And I feel like they've dealt much stronger, much brighter chrome paint applications in certain figures and even accessories that I've dealt with in the past, even this year, that I feel could have been a little shinier. And out of all the characters out there, Arnie's Mr. Freeze from Batman and Robin probably would have benefited that a little better. Now, initially, I thought that the proportions were also going to be a little wonky, especially when that often ends up being the case for a Build-A-Figure, because often Build-A-Figures, it feels like they design the pieces separately to make sure that they assemble right, but they never really think about how it's going to look like once it all comes together. For the most part, I feel like they nailed it for Mr. Freeze here, save for the legs. I feel like the legs are just a little too tall. At first, I thought that he was a little on the pudgy side as far as the top part of the torso, the top part, the first top half of his overall body physique. But if you go back and see some of the photos of Arnie in set of Batman and Robin, it looks like that's pretty much nailed 1-to-1. It's only the bottom legs that I feel were just a little stretched out, something that I was able to pick up on when I was simply just handling the pieces before assembling him on camera. So I thought that something was going to stand out there, and unfortunately it looks like I'm kind of right. I feel like he's just a little too tall, especially when we finally get him into a group shot with the remainder entries in the wave. One other part that I was worried about, and I'm technically worried about this for every Build-A-Figure, is not just how everything's going to come together proportion-wise when assembling the pieces, but would any of the articulation be compromised? It's always a concern I have whenever assembling any BAFs, if you will. And thankfully, I would say that despite some compromises, I guess you could say, Arnie kind of fares on his own rather effectively. The head is still able to turn on that general McFarlane ball joint for the top head, so he's able to turn all the way around 360. Not much in the way of tilting. He can kind of nod up and down, yes, but slightly tilt left and right, very nudgingly. It really almost doesn't even fit. Now, when it comes to the top arms, we have a few curiosities, I guess you could call it here. You technically do still have the joint, the ball joint or the rod here that connected the arm to the torso that still favors full vertical rotation, 360 degrees right there, and even proper extension, and even some slight swiveling, shrugging, and butterfly movement via the washer that is carefully placed right there. And honestly, it feels really, really good in hand. However, you'll notice that in order to do it very effectively, you got these shoulder pieces that are there to replicate the look that he had in the movie that are also technically articulated because of the way that they are assembled. They can kind of flip up and down, as you can see right there. You can kind of give them a very brushed and kind of flat shrugging look, or this kind of, popping like, I'm ready to roll. Ow, what killed the dinosaurs? My fist in your ass. I don't even know what I'm saying here, but here's where I want to present a controversy, a little bit of a debate for some of you folks to have in the comments. What's the proper way of assembling these pieces on Arnie here? Because the way I have him right now, you'll see that they actually have a completely different design from the front to the back. Here in the front, you'll have a little bit of busy texture and lining work happening, paneling work, if you will, here in the center part. Whereas in the back, you'll notice that it kind of has more real estate or empty room right here. The reason for why I find this to be a very curious kind of debacle is because the McFarlane pictures, as well as the instructions, show that this part is actually supposed to be at the front. And if you ever want to display it as such, you technically still can do that. These are not affixed to the body. They can kind of pop off at any time. They are made out of this flexible rubber. So all you really have to do is just take these pegs, fit them into the holes, and you're good. But here's where things get pretty interesting. Despite McFarlane's promo pics of Mr. Freeze showing these empty areas being on the front, if you go back once again and look up those photos of Arnie on set of Batman and Robin wearing his suit, these areas with the much more busier paneling and detailing are actually on the front, and these flat areas are actually on the back. So who got it right and who got it wrong? Me personally, I'm going to leave it like this to interpret the way that he looked in the movie, because I feel like with the passage of time, they kind of gained a little bit of agency to say that that's the more accurate look. So is McFarlane wrong, or did Batman and Robin have it wrong ever since 1997? You guys let me know. Shoulder gate! Okay, now that I got that out of my system, let's move on. Now, where exactly was I? Oh yes, the compromises. Because here is where things get just a little compromised as far as the articulation. It's technically still not a bad thing, but often is the case with a very husky and bulky character like Mr. Freeze, specifically Arnie's bulked up Mr. Freeze. You'll notice that this time around he doesn't actually have any kind of bicep swivel articulation happening because of how husky the suit overall is designed. So instead, you guessed it, they pretty much baked both joints into the elbow. He only has one joint that allows the elbow to bend at a 90-degree angle, but they baked the swivel into the top part of that joint. So that's where he's exactly able to rotate at that point and slightly bend inwards and outwards. But he's not able to bend all the way up at the elbow like usual McFarlanes can do. However, like most McFarlanes, he does have that very flush wrist joint, even with a husky character like this, that is fully able to rotate the wrist 360 degrees at the much farther part of that joint, but then halfway through via this mid-cut piece of the wrist is able to bend fully inwards but slightly outwards, only because of the way that the cuff is designed. So it favors being able to bend inwards, but more so than it's able to bend outwards at the wrist. The torso, however, is actually pretty nice. You do have the mid-torso cut here despite the pudginess of the belly right here because of the way that the armor is designed. Nevertheless, it's still able to rotate the full 360 and it feels pretty fluid while at the same time not too tight, not too loose. Good crunching and extension front and back and even side to side. Then you do have the waist that can not necessarily rotate all the way around because of how husky the diaper really is. I can kind of tell that from even assembling the piece that was not going to be the case, but it can technically still nudge left and right to allow further mobility of the waist and even further crunching on both parts right there. So he can definitely favor several different poses that are reliant on the mid-torso, so that is pretty cool. Now, when we get to the top leg joints, things get just a little rough because this is often the case with a lot of Build-A-Figures. Technically, he can still extend the leg towards the front like so, and even extend it slightly towards the back like that. But because of the way that it's assembled and the way that the diaper is formed with this rubberized piece, sometimes because the user, if you will, had to assemble it all together and not necessarily a factory, you sometimes get these weird cases where the top leg joint will pinch the diaper and you run the risk of either causing some wear and tear or some chipping or some tearing of the rubberized diaper piece. So do be careful whenever you kind of flush this back into place, because right now it's actually doing what it's supposed to do, which is to kind of tuck itself underneath the rubber piece. But there's already been at least one case where I was kind of messing around with freeze and it did pinch the rubber and kind of press it inward. See it like that. I kind of forced it right there just to kind of give an example, but it pretty much causes that. So you just got to be careful to tuck it underneath and make sure that you don't risk damaging your figure. Same thing goes for whenever you do the leg extension, because it can technically still do that, but I feel like you run an even further risk of damaging the diaper because of that. It's kind of like a your mileage may vary sort of situation, because some folks will be able to get a piece that was perfectly laser aligned to match the joints, and then others will probably have a much more difficult time fitting in the legs and popping them in all the way. So just double check your Mr. Freeze, make sure you're not damaging any parts right here. And then we get to the knees, where they pretty much kind of played into the same sensibilities as the elbow, where you only have one joint that can fully bend at a 90-degree angle, but not much further than that. However, they baked a swivel on the lower part of that knee joint that can rotate the shin, the calf, and pretty much the entirety of the lower left leg. So you can't really bend at 2 points, but you technically still have two joints favoring articulation and posability for a tanky character like Mr. Freeze here. Then we get to the ankles, where unfortunately we don't have that flush ankle piece that I like. We only have this very standard and pretty, robust piece that is conjoined with the rest of the lower leg, and only on the inside we have kind of like a Marvel Legend-esque kind of ankle joint that I don't particularly like, because it's super ratcheted and super hard to be able to bend downwards like so, and furthermore to bend all the way up, as you can kind of hear right there. It's one of the more rigid and very frustrating ones, and you could practically forget about any kind of ankle articulation. That's where the swivel on the bottom part of the knee comes into play. So if you ever want to rotate the foot in the more horizontal kind of manner, you're going to have to rely on this bottom knee joint as opposed to the ankles, because the ankles are only going to allow you to pivot the foot inwards and outwards at an angle like so. You're not really going to be able to rotate it completely, flat. So that's one of the compromises that I frankly do not like. But at least you do still have the toes happening on the boot right there, the ironclad boot that can fully bend much more than I was anticipating. So You do have that. Now, Mr. Freeze does actually pose another problem that frankly took me a while to even really notice, because I was pretty surprised with several different aspects about the entirety of the wave. Not just Mr. Freeze, but Batman, Robin, Poison Ivy, Batgirl. And then it finally dawned on me something that was kind of disappointing. Accessories. Or I should say, lack of accessories. And what tipped me off was the fact that Mr. Freeze does in fact come with his own accessory. His freeze ray gun, which is pretty modeled nicely, decently. Still has that lack of paint that I feel they could have benefited from, but at least sculpting is pretty decent. The paint application pretty much matches that of his suit, so it's pretty thematic, if you will. The only thing that kind of bugs me, I don't know if it's designed by choice or if I got a defective one, but if you look closely, it's almost like it's cut out in half here. I don't know if this is meant to kind of favor the design of his shoulders when you pose him with it, or supposed to flush with his forearm. I honestly don't get why it's designed like that. It just kind of bothers me because it just looks like it's supposed to be much more filled out right here, and I just got a really warped one, or like I said, defective one that just came out of the machine, the factory, just like that, out of the conveyor belt, and it just looks very off. But as far as just kind of delivering the message that this is in fact the freeze ray gun from Batman and Robin is pretty cool. But to me, my favorite thing is the added piece to kind of give it this, muzzle freeze flare, if you will, that's coming out of the nozzle, coming out of the little hole right here. So it's kind of neat that it delivers this really cool effect that frankly to me is pretty nice, because not only is it a translucent blue, but you'll notice it kind of gradients out and fades out into a saturated solid blue right here towards the front. So I like this effect. I really dig it. It actually kind of makes the gun feel a little bit more alive, especially in the middle of poses or dynamic kind of action stances, etc. So it's pretty cool that they gave Mr. Freeze this, especially for, like I said, posability and kind of making the entire ensemble come alive. But frankly, this was the catalyst that made me realize he's the only one with a proper accessory. None of the other characters really come with any accessories. And before you say anything, yes, I know. You have these like freeze pieces that came with some of the figures. I believe that these two came with Robin, and then these two, I believe, came with Batman himself. So these are meant to kind of go on their person. So you can either put these on Batman's legs, Batman's arms, and then these specifically are supposed to go on Robin to kind of mimic that look that he had at the beginning of the movie where he gets frozen by Mr. Freeze and Batman must thaw him out. So you have a little bit of curvature happening here with some of the pieces to kind of symbolize where they're supposed to go. I believe this one even has a little bit of a hook right about right there to then fit onto one of his arms. And then this one definitely has a molding, if you will, right here in the middle to go into Robin's head, to then kind of put it on here and make it look like he's frozen in place. So yeah, pretty cool to kind of replicate that scene and kind of give it, like I said, this very dynamic look up on your shelf. But what happened to the batarangs? What happened to the gadgets, the accessories? Like I said, the very character-focused accessories. Because before you say anything, before you type out that comment saying, it's a Build-A-Figure wave, all that plastic got allocated to building Freeze here. Yeah, I'm sorry, very difficult to buy when you have plenty of other Build-A-Figure waves in McFarlane's past, ever since 2020, 2021, where they still threw in accessories for some of their Build-A-Figure waves. Hell, this year we had a Build-A-Figure wave. No matter how slightly rushed and kind of bad it was, the Dark Knight trilogy is probably one of the better examples of that. And the pieces of that Bane being thrown in with several different characters in that wave, but out of all of them, the only one that really suffered was Two-Face. He didn't really come with anything. Scarecrow, however, came with extra hands. Joker came with the cash base. And then Batman came with his batarangs. And as you can see right here, Arnie's really the only one that's ready to rock and glock and freeze. Everyone else is just kind of has to resort to standing in a heroic pose or in a fighting pose or in a flirtatious pose in Poison Ivy's case. I just kind of wish that there would have been something else kind of thrown in because, again, per the pattern, we've seen McFarlane be able to toss in some accessories, even if they're just the stereotypical Batarang, which I would have taken gladly for a character like Clooney's Batman, especially with those very Schumacher, very over-the-top gadgets that he's got picking up at the beginning of his suit-up scene, where he got the very, very brandish Batarangs with that are pretty much just the glorified bat symbols, only in Batarang form. Same thing for Robin, the Robin symbol, pretty much in a Batarang kind of stance, and then a grapple for Batgirl. That would have been just fine. As far as Poison Ivy, maybe like a little vine whip that she can kind of hold in her hand, especially since one of her hands looks like it could hold something. It looks like it was molded to hold something, so I have a little bit of a theory there, but everybody else is just brandishing fists. Just throwing in these ice pieces, I feel like it just doesn't really stack up to having a proper arsenal for your Bat family characters, even if it is from one of the weakest, if not the weakest, Batman film ever in history. You still managed to really hit home with great figures here that make up a really decent wave to close out 2023. Specifically that Clooney Batman, which we've already seen was able to hit the mark with that Ultimate 6-pack movie collection. And though it wasn't able to achieve those heights, I feel like Robin, Batgirl, especially Poison Ivy, and even the Build-A-Figure Mr. Freeze were able to hold their own and really complete this wave, especially coming in those really sweet decadent boxes that I'm needlessly gushing over. I just feel like this could have been a very perfect wave, a complete wave, not necessarily a standalone release, but a figure wave that is supposed to be bought in bulk for all 4 figures to come together in the same case. But instead it just comes up short because of those accessories. That's mainly my main complaint, and then my Robin, just like I said, having that really weird shade of red. But all that aside, I feel like this is probably still an effective pickup. Not just Batman, but also the entirety of the wave, if you're a fan of the McFarlane figures that they've been able to turn out recently. And that's still coming from someone who has to ride the bandwagon and say, yeah, I really, really dislike, damn near hate Batman and Robin. Frankly, I can't remember if I gave Clooney a proper rating in my initial review of the figure along with the Kilmer in that separate video, but in the event that I didn't, I would say he is damn near a 9 out of 10 if it wasn't for the cape. I prefer the cloth. I feel like the cloth one is a 9. This one is an 8 out of 10. Robin and Batgirl get respective 7 out of 10s because actually they're pretty effective. Like I said, there's a couple of quirks here and there, but overall they are in fact good figures. Poison Ivy, on the other hand, is a very, very high 8. Almost a 9 if maybe, like I said, she came with a vine whip or just an extra little something to really amplify the character. And Mr. Freeze is also a 7 out of 10 because I do feel like a few of the compromises hinder the articulation, and just the paint apps could have been a bit more welcome on some of those suit aesthetics, especially since he's so chrome in the movie that we've seen McFarlane do chrome before. I feel like it's a little too muted here. Outside of that though, I still recommend the entirety of the wave. If you guys want to pick up your own, try out the affiliate links in the description for either Amazon or Entertainment Earth if they are in fact still in stock. And full disclaimer, they do help out the channel in the process, but if you were in the market for getting the Batman and Robin wave, this is a very nice way to send off 2023 and see if maybe through manifestation we can bring on the Kilmer wave. Batman Forever, Two-Face, Jim Carrey Riddler, that version of Robin. I am definitely still welcoming that wave in spades. Now, if you already have the Batman and Robin wave in hand, let me know what you guys think of the wave thus far. Do you think it's one of the highlights of 2023 from McFarlane Toys, or do you think that they kind of fumbled the ball just a tad with some of the entries, or did it kind of feel a little bit in between? I can honestly say didn't necessarily get the rushed vibe as I did with the Dark Knight Trilogy wave, but that might be the different case for others that managed to get from different retailers. Maybe they did get a unit that felt a little wonky. Let me know down below, and as always, if you guys enjoyed the video, hit the thumbs up button. If you did not, hit the thumbs down, and as always, stay humble, and I'll see you guys later. Take care.